It's the mid-1970s. I'm about 11 years old, and I'm in Sunday school. Sister Mary Ellen has just finished drilling us on the Ten Commandments, when up goes a hand in the back row. It's a kid named Bobby, and he's not interested in the Ten Commandments. "Hey, sister." Remember, this is Massachusetts. "Hey, sister, what's adultery?" And so, with a stricken look on her face, Sister Mary Ellen tried to answer the question while at the same time not answer it. And Bobby just kept on asking more questions. What do you mean a man is with a woman who's not his wife? What's an immoral situation? And what do you mean they were carrying on? Well, mercifully, just as things were about to get out of hand, the class ended. Sister Mary Ellen probably went back to the convent and poured herself a stiff drink. We all ran home to do some research in the family dictionary. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 33, in which we look at the fascinating history of the Ten Commandments and how Americans have embraced, reimagined, and repurposed them over the last 150 years. We are coming to you this week from the Charlton Heston Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com. And on Facebook, and Twitter, and Instagram. Leading us into the promised land week after week is our executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So welcome everyone to In the Past Lane. It's midway in the summer and I'm about to go on vacation with my family. First, it's a week in San Antonio, Texas, where the temperature has been hitting 100 plus of late. If I get a chance, I'll sneak off to do some In the Past Lane recording at the Alamo, which of course is located right in downtown San Antonio. Then, after San Antonio, we head back north to spend a week at the beach in my hometown of Gloucester, Massachusetts. Gloucester also has a lot of cool history, so I'll be sure to bring my recording equipment, just in case there's a rainy day. But before I head for the airport, we have a podcast episode to dive into. And don't worry, even though I'm on vacation, I'll still be dropping episodes every Friday, and sometimes on Saturday. Oh, and one more thing. Don't forget, In the Past Lane is eligible for the annual podcast awards. As I've noted, they're sort of like the Oscars or the Emmys for podcasting, except that all the voting is done by people like you and me. That means I need your help. Finalists for the awards are determined by the number of votes, or what they call nominations, by the public. So I'd really appreciate it if you took a minute to nominate us. Just head over to podcastawards.com, that's podcastawards.com, and click on nominations. You'll find In the Past Lane in the Society and Culture category. And, this is really important, voting ends on July 31st, so don't delay. Thanks. Okay, people, see that old guy in the robe, holding out his arms and parting the sea? We're going that way, so put on a life jacket. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. The Ten Commandments in American history? Isn't that a story more likely to be situated in Israel rather than the U.S.? Well, actually, there's a fascinating history of the Ten Commandments in the United States. And a recent news story out of Arkansas makes this crystal clear. A few years ago, an Arkansas legislator gained passage of a law authorizing the placement of a monument of the Ten Commandments on the ground of the Arkansas state capitol. Now, this monument, a 6-foot-high slab of polished marble with the Ten Commandments inscribed on it, had many supporters. But it also had many critics, including civil liberties groups like the ACLU, which filed lawsuits claiming the monument violated separation of church and state. Now, despite this opposition, Just a few weeks ago in June 2017, the Ten Commandments Monument was unveiled with great fanfare. But then, just hours later, in the middle of the night, well, let's let CNN pick up the story.
A controversial monument of the Ten Commandments at the Arkansas State Capitol was destroyed overnight. Get this, less than 24 hours after it was built. Police say around 4:45 in the morning local time, a 32-year-old man rammed his vehicle straight into that monument. You can see the aftermath there, knocking it over and simply shattering it. Michael T. Reed now faces several charges, including defacing an object of public respect, criminal mischief in the first degree, and trespassing on Capitol grounds.
This incident is just the latest chapter in a long, interesting, and surprising history of the Ten Commandments in American life. That history is chronicled in a new book titled Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments. Here's what's written on the back of the book. While the physical tablets that Moses received on Mount Sinai have been lost to history, the Ten Commandments' divine do's and don'ts are alive and well today in America. In fact, the Ten Commandments have woven themselves into the very fabric of American culture and history. At once theological, cultural, political, and moral, the Ten Commandments have become part and parcel of American life. To learn more about how and why some Americans have become obsessed with the Ten Commandments, I'll talk with the book's author, historian Jenna Weissman Joselit. There's an amazing story here, people, that I think you're going to love. But before we get to that interview, here are a few things that Jenna and I speak about that it might be helpful to have a few more details on. First, she begins her book with the story of a classic 19th century American hoax. Now, this was perpetrated by a guy named David Wyrick. He seems to have carved and then secretly buried several inscribed stones at a Native American archaeological site in Newark, Ohio. Then he led an archaeological dig that, amazingly, discovered the stones in 1860. The one stone that garnered the most attention had the Ten Commandments inscribed upon it in Hebrew. Wyrick seems to have concocted this scheme to prove his theory that the ancient peoples who built the great burial mounds in Newark, Ohio, were the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. And who knows, he may or may not have been interested in making a little money as well. In any case, the story of this archaeological discovery caused a sensation in 1860. But it soon dimmed as skeptics raised questions about the stone's authenticity, and then the American Civil War broke out. Jenna also discusses the story of a U.S. senator from Alabama who proposed in the 1890s that the United States make knowledge of the Ten Commandments part of the examination that one had to pass to become an American citizen. In that same discussion, we mentioned Judge Roy Moore. Back in 2001, Moore was elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, but he was removed from that position just 2 years later, when he refused to comply with a federal order to remove a monument of the Ten Commandments that he had commissioned and placed in the Alabama Judicial Building. Finally, Jenna and I talk a bit about the term Judeo-Christian tradition that's often used these days, typically by religious conservatives, to describe what they argue is a key influence in traditional American ideas and institutions. The important thing to note here is that this phrase, Judeo-Christian tradition, only begins to appear in public discourse after World War II. It emerged as part of a post-war effort by Jewish Americans to assert their Americanness. American wasn't just a Christian nation, they said. It was a Judeo-Christian nation. And as you'll soon hear, a popular three-dimensional expression of this desire was a prominent display outside of synagogues of the Ten Commandments. And, hang on, what's up, Lulu?
Okay, can we just get to the interview before everyone's dead?
All right, good point, Lulu. Let's get to it. In the Past Lane, podcast about history and why it matters. We'll be right back.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
Okay, with me now is Jenna Weissman Joselit. She is the Charles E. Smith Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of History at George Washington University. She's the author of several books on American life in the 20th and 20th centuries, including The Wonders of America, Reinventing Jewish Culture, 1880 to 1950, A Perfect Fit, Clothes, Character, and the Promise of America, and A Parade of Faiths, Immigration and American Religion. She joins us today to talk about her latest book, Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments, just published by Oxford University Press. Jenna Weissman Joselit, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Delighted to be here.
Okay, well, your book is quite fascinating, and I want to ask you how you came to the subject, but before I get to that, I want to ask you, or just sort of have you situate the whole story for us. So this is an interesting topic, right? The history of the Ten Commandments in America. And at first glance, it might throw some people, but as soon as you open the first few pages, read the first few pages, you realize it is a fascinating American story, even though we think of the Ten Commandments as not really coming from America.
Right.
And so that's really one of the two foundational things that you start with, which is one is that America, perhaps more than any other nation, has embraced the Ten Commandments as some sort of a symbol, some sort of a meaningful idea. Mm-hmm. And that also over time, this has not been a fixed thing. It's from the mid-19th century on up to the present day. What we think the Ten Commandments are has changed quite a bit. So maybe you could start us back in that early 19th century or mid-19th century period, the beginning of your story. And what exactly did Americans think of the Ten Commandments? And how did that begin to change after the Civil War?
Okay, wonderful questions all, and I'm delighted that you understood the point of the book, which was to look at the Ten Commandments as a kind of a living document and as something that's been so richly imagined, more so in America than at any other place. So the book opens with a curious episode, and that is the the discovery of an alleged ancient version of the Ten Commandments buried way deep in the bosom of an Indian burial mound in central Ohio. And that was quite an unusual find and sparked the collective imagination from Ohio radiating outward throughout the nation. And I think the point of the story, clearly it was a hoax, but the point of the story is that Americans way back when felt so deeply about the Ten Commandments. It was almost quite literally a foundational document. And to find it in the soil and not just in the kind of psychological landscape of the country, I thought was a wonderful way to start the book and a kind of index of how affirming the Ten Commandments have been historically for the American people writ large.
Yeah, in some ways, we don't know exactly this guy's name is David Wyrick and what the motivations were behind this interesting episode. But in some way, it represents, and you reference this in the book, that part of the love or the adoration of the Ten Commandments is this kind of quest for, affirmation as we're a young nation. We know we're very young. We refer to ourselves as a new republic and all of that, even well into the 19th century. And there's a certain gravitas, obviously, that comes with discovering something like the Ten Commandments or a really ancient version of it in America. Is that accurate to say that that's at least part of what, and maybe one of the reasons why you started off the book with that episode?
Yes, and I just thought it was a marvelous yarn. What a great story. One of the challenges of this book was to write it in a very narrative way, to tell stories, which is a bit of a departure from my previous works. And so I was in hot pursuit of wonderful stories that pivoted on the Ten Commandments, either on their embrace or rejection or rediscovery or reformulation. And this archaeological hoax is something I just stumbled across in a footnote. See, important to check footnotes. And with just a tiny little reference in a student's work. I had never heard of Wyrick. I had never heard of the Ten Commandments in the Indian burial mound. None of that. But I followed this wonderful paper trail, and turns out there's just tons of stuff, including material in the rare book room at the New York Public Library. So it just opened up all sorts of exciting narrative opportunities, storytelling opportunities, and also a wonderful way to really take seriously how profoundly connected Americans are to the Ten Commandments in ways that are curious, as you point out. We tend to think of the Ten Commandments more as a global phenomenon, and their origins are an Israelite phenomenon. So to think of them as an American phenomenon seems somewhat of a stretch. But when you start to dig, and you don't have to go all the way deep into the bosom of an Indian burial mound to find all sorts of indices that America historically has taken the Ten Commandments quite to its heart.
Yeah, and another thing interesting going on at the same time, or roughly the same time, is that, scholarship, biblical scholarship is advancing. Mm-hmm. And so that's, while there's a deep reverence for the Ten Commandments, there's also, in some ways, voices of skepticism, or voices, if not skepticism, trying to say, well, they meant something in their time and place, but they really don't speak to us more than in small ways now. And that's really almost immediately offset, or begins to be offset, by a kind of a renewed intensity in the late 19th century, with people calling for a national holiday, a Alabama senator saying we should require knowledge of the Ten Commandments as a part of a citizenship exam.
Yeah, that was another footnotey thing, quite extraordinary and a little chilling. I think for me, the trajectory of the Ten Commandments going from something that was inclusive and embracing and that it afforded an opportunity for Americans of all stripes to come together, and then to be something that's a test, was a little bit disarming, I should say. But it's part of the story, and it continues very much to be part of the story. And I think it's no coincidence that it's an Alabama senator who's proposing the Ten Commandments as a kind of guardian rather than a sentinel.
That's right, because Judge Roy Moore from Alabama will sort of provide in some ways the kind of a bookend to this overall story.
Exactly.
So do you detect any reason why there's this sudden burst in the late 19th century for calls for reverencing, calls for acknowledging the Ten Commandments in many ways?
It's a wonderful question, and it's something the book really tries, I hope successfully, to not only to tackle, but to answer. And I think it has to do with the post-Civil War period, the kind of urgent, insistent need for some kind of unity. This is also the period of intense immigration.
Yes.
So, change is just everywhere. It seems like the country is coming undone in so many different ways and from so many different directions. And there's the Ten Commandments that seems to be able to hold the nation intact and to offer something formulaic that seems to be both divine and earthly, that's widely shared, that holds out the prospect of the rule of law, and with the rule of law, a sense of unity. I mean, one of the most beautiful things I found at the Library of Congress, where I did much of my research, was a poster that appeared in the wake of the Civil War, and the top half of the poster takes the form of an open Bible, and it's open to those passages in Exodus where the story of the Ten Commandments unfolds, and the Bible itself is resting on the back of a large American eagle, and it's flanked on one side by Lady Liberty and on the other by Lady Justice. And it's very beautiful. It's also beautiful, not just literally, but symbolically, because it reflects the hug that America gives to the Ten Commandments and the way that it situates it so firmly within the context of these American personalities. So I think that it's no coincidence that that image arises in the wake of the Civil War and at the time of immigration, because it serves as a kind of reminder about the promise of America.
And it's also, as these folks quickly find, the Ten Commandments can be quite flexible, and they become these vessels that people can put into them, or both the Ten Commandments literally, but also then their variations on it, which you get into, that people take the notion of a Ten Commandments list of almost anything.
Right.
But before that, is it accurate to say that there's an effort to sort of soften the Ten Commandments a little bit too, to make them a little more palatable for a modern age, not necessarily a secular age, but a less Calvinistic?
Well, there are a couple of attempts, I think, with tongues firmly planted in cheeks to suggest that maybe the Ten Commandments needed a little bit of contemporizing, and that certain things like blasphemy and cursing had fallen out of vogue, and maybe it should be replaced by a new commandment like don't drink, or something along those lines. But I think that those were said, their jokes are very reflective of the way society sees itself, so, I'm not so quick to dismiss them out of hand, but they take the Ten Commandments seriously enough to make them the butt of humor. But I think that there is something about the Ten Commandments that offers a blueprint, whether you take them literally or not. And I think the tenness, the symmetry, the formulaicness, the the numeral quality of the Ten Commandments is very appealing.
Yeah, they have sort of a built-in order to them, and that's reflective of, in many ways, American culture, maybe even in the late 19th century, American industrial culture and progressivism, where things are numbered and labeled. And
right, order. It's all about order, yes.
Right, in a tumultuous time, which may also account in some ways in the 21st century why the Ten Commandments have such continued staying power, and how we find ways to, as a society, to add new meaning to them or, apply them to everyday life.
Right. That was a really startling find when I would rifle through the digital equivalent of the card catalog at the Library of Congress. I'd come across so many different applications of the Ten Commandments, which I didn't know about going in. I knew of the doo-wop, Ten Commandments, the Moonglow version of the Ten Commandments of love.
Yep.
I didn't know about Paul Anka having the Teen Commandments. I also didn't know about the Ten Commandments of pomology, the Ten Commandments of automobile driving, the Ten Commandments of beauty complexion. I didn't know that there were so many applications. And for me, that was not so much a sign of the corruption of the Ten Commandments as a sign of their vitality and their malleability, that they just lent themselves to so many features of daily life.
Yeah. Paul Anka's 10 Commandments is quite fascinating for that time period. And, of course, the 10th commandment is to follow the 10 Commandments.
Right.
So
you know it.
It's very interesting.
Well, my favorite is don't be the ninth one. Yeah, don't be... Is it
don't be a follower?
Yeah, don't be a caboose, be an engine or something like that. It's so funny.
Okay, I can't resist. Let's take a moment to listen to a bit of Paul Anka's song, The 10 Commandments. They are so earnest and so very 1958.
Now, these are the 10 Commandments. 1, stop and think before you drink.
2, don't let your parents down. They brought you up.
Number 3, be humble enough to obey. You will be given orders yourself someday. 4, at the first moment, turn away from unclean thinking. At the first moment.
5, don't show off.
But it's really the music that accompanies that really sets this thing on its ear.
Yeah. So in some ways, the 10 Commandments are these great little shorthand lists for all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But in terms of the Bible, I mean, do they also in some ways simplify the Bible? The Bible is just this massive document that many people have sort of partial familiarity with. And if they're churchgoers, they have sort of somewhat regular contact with it. But there's something attractive, again, maybe in that high-speed industrialized American mind that, can I just get the bullet points, and the 10 Commandments seem to provide that.
Right. Boil it down. And it's also one of the few instances that we know of in which allegedly God spoke directly to the folks. So it's not mediated and clouded over by all sorts of interpretations. There they are, And there are so many visual representations of that. So I think its seeming directness and its pithiness and its weight, and I think the stoniness also. There seems to be something so enduring, timeless about the way in which they are depicted. So all of that makes for quite a compelling package. And I think, without sounding irreverent, which I've been accused of in the course of working on this book, and I don't mean to be, I just find American stuff really amusing, that there was a way of kind of bringing them down a notch by casting them in this light. And I don't see that. I see that it attests to their power, not to their weakness.
Yep. In some ways, people trying to find ways to make them relevant.
Mm-hmm.
You may not agree with the ways that they're trying to make them relevant, but there's a genuine desire to do so.
Right.
Another factor here at work seems to be, obviously, almost any topic in American history, the market. The market plays a big role in some of this, maybe not as the inspiration, but certainly the market senses opportunity in more recent times with the Moses action doll or action figure. But also, you pointed out many things in your book in terms of, material culture, things that reflect the 10 Commandments, bookmarks and posters.
Jewelry.
Yeah. To what extent is that a factor in the 10 Commandments? Or is business just simply seizing onto something? Or are they propelling it in some way?
Oh, you never know whether, tail wagging dog or the other way around. But clearly, and you know this across the board, 10 Commandments isn't the only religious phenomenon that lent itself to commercialization. I think, for example, of Lee Schmidt's work on the holidays and the way in which they've been so heavily commodified. So, clearly there's something in American culture that, and in the marketplace, that creates a symbiotic relationship, though fraught at times, between marketplace and the divine.
Your book is very interestingly organized around these different sort of thematic threads that run with the 10 Commandments. And eventually we get to the post-World War II era and the emergence of, other scholars have written about this extensively, this sort of idea of the Judeo-Christian heritage. This idea is, it's spoken of these days as something it was in the mind of, the founding fathers, when in fact it's more of a 20th century invention.
Right.
And at that very moment, Cecil B. DeMille is, storyboarding his epic film, The Ten Commandments, which is released in 1956. And clearly that film is a major part of this story, a major part of your book. So what is it? Is there anything unique about the timing of DeMille's film and also some of the key elements in it that he's trying to appeal to?
Yeah, I think that the post-war era is very much like the 19th century in the sense that everything's up for grabs. People have just undergone wrenching social change. There's a period of massive immigration again. Suburbanization, the seemingly eternal verities don't hold up quite so firmly as they might have. And the 10 Commandments kind of comes in once again to reassure everybody that there's a solidity to American culture and there's hopefulness.
Hey, what do you think? Should we give a quick listen to that 1956 classic, The Ten Commandments? Let's pick it up where Charlton Heston, Moses, receives the Ten Commandments from God. And FYI, God does all the talking.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not kill.
And I think that the movie, I don't know that DeMille was aware of all of this. I think that clearly he has attacking communism on his mind more than any other kind of highfalutin rhetoric. But it turns out that in this instance, as in so many others, that there's a meeting, kind of unplanned convergence, rather, that's a better word, of ideas and their manifestation. And so it's in the air, this idea that we're all Americans together. And then DeMille comes along and makes this movie. And it provides a kind of cinematic and popular cultural support for the idea of the Judeo-Christian heritage, which had largely been much more of a clerical conceit and then a political conceit. Now it becomes more of a grassroots conceit. And as I mentioned in the book, it's no coincidence that many synagogues, which had always had some version of the Ten Commandments, but generally pretty modest in scale and very internal to the sanctuary, were, when they're in the process of building these brand new suburban post-war houses of worship, relocate the Ten Commandments from the inside of the sanctuary to the exterior of the building, and they're often very large. And I don't think that's just an aesthetic decision, or aesthetic gesture. Clearly it's bound up with the kind of architecture that post-war synagogues inhabit, but I think there's a broader point to be made, and that is that it's, as I write in the book, it's a kind of exclamation point. We belong, we're part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. And so it's really a very innocent and sweet and well-intentioned attempt to acknowledge common bonds, or to make clear to the outside world that Jews want to be very much a part of the larger culture.
Yeah, a notion of a expanding idea of what it means to be an American, which is always a fascinating thing. And sometimes there's a dark side to it, but in this case, it does seem to be a true expansion of the definition of who's an American and who belongs, which is a very affirming kind of idea.
Very affirming and very expansive, literally, spatially expansive, as well as psychically expansive, I think. The other point I wanted to make, and it did get lost in the shuffle, is that the fascinating backstory here about America's relationship to the Ten Commandments is that it's a story of ongoing circulation. They keep on circulating. They move from the sanctuary. They move from one religious group to another. They move from being Christian to becoming more American. They move from inside, outside. They move from being kind of religious poster art to becoming popular films and jewelry and all sorts of quotidian things. And that's really fascinating to me, that they're so much in circulation all the time. And that's what I was trying to get at. We think of the Ten Commandments as so static, as stony, kind of standing like sentinels. And it turns out that, at least in America, they're so richly imagined. They've assumed so many different forms. You would never have conjured up this in a million years, that they'd be the subject of exhibitions and movies and bracelets and stuff that you could actually stand up as a facsimile in your own home. Americans are nothing if not inventive when it comes to either merchandising, commodifying, or thinking cleverly about religion.
Right. I imagine, I didn't have I've actually thought about looking this up, or asking a tattoo artist I know, but I'm guessing I've seen many Ten Commandments tattoos over the years, and I'm guessing that's a pretty consistent one, right up there with the bald eagle and maybe the Statue of Liberty or the American flag. So that's sort of a modern, although tattoos aren't new, the tattoo phenomenon, booming of tattoos certainly is a new thing.
Well, if this book goes into another edition, I can add that. I didn't add that tattoo stuff, but absolutely. And that's really a great idea, inscribing it on the body, not just the body politic, but the individual body.
Right. It's fascinating stuff. As is the, back to more traditional representations, the big stone representations. And that's the other side story with the Ten Commandments film in the 50s, is there's this organization, I think it's the Fraternal Order of the Golden Eagle.
Fraternal Order of Eagles.
Of Eagles. Oh, okay. I'm amping them up a little bit.
You're gilding them.
Yes. But they are dedicated to erecting these, 6-foot-high replicas of the Ten Commandments wherever they can. And it's not just a parallel movement, it's actually somewhat connected to DeMille. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Fraternal Order of Eagles had a bee in its bonnet, to mix my metaphors, for the Ten Commandments, because one of its members, a judge in Minnesota, thought it'd be a really great idea at a time of increasing concern about juvenile delinquency to post paper versions of the Ten Commandments in all sorts of courthouses, particularly, I guess, lower courthouses, so that the youthful offender would see them and have a moment of awakening, something very innocent and silly about that. So the Fraternal Order of Eagles had been busily engaged in making and dispatching, I would say, thousands of these proclamations, declarations, whatever you want to call them, of the Ten Commandments. And then I think DeMille and his publicity people got wind of that, and then they thought, let's join forces. And there's wonderful correspondence in DeMille's papers, which are, interestingly enough, at Brigham Young University.
Well, there you go.
There you go, that's right. And so they kind of hit on this really brilliant idea that the Fraternal Order of Eagles, with DeMille's backing and imprimatur, would enlarge the circumference of this campaign to not just post, but now to plant these large 6-foot monuments, which some widths would granite movie posters.
Yeah.
And so it was a way not only to keep DeMille's film in circulation, but then to ensure it would have an afterlife and that the Ten Commandments would really stand tall and firm like talismans, big talismans, monumental talismans, in civic squares across the country. And of course, that set very much into the ethos of the time, and was also a very strong physical rebuke to communism. It just sort of worked, and of course it doesn't work now. And one of the fascinating things, and it's kind of the tail end of the story, is that many of these monuments have now been hauled into court on the grounds that they violate the First Amendment. And it's very nice to have Ten Commandments planted everywhere, but not on public property. And so there's a very celebrated case that took place in Texas, where there was a Fraternal Order of Eagles monument that was donated in the early 60s, and then a passerby didn't quite cotton to them and saw somewhat of a red flag and challenged their constitutionality, and the case ended up in the Supreme Court, where in that instance at least, and this was in 2005, the Supremes said that given the weight of history, given the seeming museological context in which these Ten Commandments appeared, one could liken their context to a sculpture garden, rather than a municipal entity. And given history and given the affinity that Americans have historically felt for the Ten Commandments, best to leave them alone, not to remove them or take them off their pedestal or put them in a closet, as Judge Roy Moore had been enjoined to do. At the same time, and this is where the story gets so complicated, there's a number of counties in Kentucky which took advantage of the growing interest in on the part of the evangelical right in the Ten Commandments to post a number of Ten Commandments in courthouses in these two counties. And the ACLU got involved, and on and on and on and on. And ultimately, that case also wended its way to the Supreme Court, and it was joined to the Texas thing. And so the Supremes adjudicated both cases concurrently, and so they ruled okie doke to let the Ten Commandments monument stay in Texas because of its pedigree, its historicity. Not okay for Kentucky to post these more contemporaneous iterations of the Ten Commandments because it's it's clearly an overt religious statement, not necessarily a cultural statement. So, many people felt that they were splitting hairs at the bottom line.
Right.
And I think people in the judicial community were not delighted. They wanted a firm yay or nay, not something that was both yay or nay. But I think as I reflect on this as a historian, it was a good call because there is one thing historically to think, and of course we're very much in the throes of this now, rethinking monuments.
Very much.
But I think in 2005 that wasn't in the air. So given where the country was at the time, I think that decision made sense in the context of Texas. And in the context of Kentucky, although the folks in Kentucky and their supporters were quite dismayed, it made sense in that context too when you think about the changing sociology, the changing complexion of America, and the fact that it was a recent effort as opposed to one that dated back 40-so years.
Yeah.
So a long-winded answer, and the point is it's very complicated. There are no clear-cut answers to this. And you asked me at the beginning of our conversation what brought me to the book, and it's that. Actually, it wasn't that so much. It was the site, and I guess I had seen it both on TV and in print. The scenes of people, largely men, in shorts, walking around the circumference of the Supreme Court, brandishing miniature versions in cardboard of the Ten Commandments, making it clear that they were strongly in favor of their presence. And that visual and the intensity and the kind of contrast between men in shorts and the augustness of the Ten Commandments, which are now in a faux stone facsimile version. There was so much stuff there. I thought I got to write about that.
You've given two great examples of, I'd love to tell students these things where you say, oh, that book was started by reading a footnote. And in this case, you've said both a footnote, opened at least a part of your book to you. And then also in this case, just a fascinating visual, somebody walking around with a styrofoam set of tablets. So it's always interesting to see how scholars find their work and how where ideas come from.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very interested in and very devoted to material culture. And in many cases, that's my point of departure. I see an object or I see a visual or I see an article of clothing and it just sets me off, as opposed to having the material culture be like a backup to the text.
Right.
I move from the object on out. The same thing with the Ten Commandments. You sort of think of them not just as a compilation of words in a particular order, but as a round-topped stony thing or just two pillars, something visual. And that got me thinking too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Material culture is often overlooked or taken as self-evident, and it's anything but that when we stop and think about where these things come from and what they purport or what they're trying to say or what they're saying without even knowing that they're saying.
Yeah, and it's like value added. Value added. It just deepens the repertoire of sources. And if you eliminate them, you eliminate a very complex and often deeply felt and sometimes even funny aspect of American history.
Yeah. The one last thing I wanted to ask you about was there's a piece in I can't remember actually where in the book, but where Dr. Laura Schlesinger and David Hazoni come up, where you talk about these sort of lifestyle self-help books that become big bestsellers. They're not the same kind of book, but they're basically how the Ten Commandments, work in everyday life, or how to live a good life if you follow these updated kind of modernized understandings of the Ten Commandments. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, well, I was struck. This is yet another example of the way in which new meanings accrue and attach themselves to the Ten Commandments as they circulate. So here we have Laura Schlesinger, who, in her newly found religious personality of, I forget when exactly that happened, but she just takes to the Ten Commandments and together with Rabbi Lester Vogel writes this book that very consciously uses the Ten Commandments as a template for how to live an orderly life. So it's a kind of a vernacularizing of the Ten Commandments, but it also is a way to, I think, make them a form of therapy. I was really struck by that. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I'm not a big fan of that. That leaches some of the augustness of the Ten Commandments. It's really not about. I don't know what it's not about, but if you were to read the text, you would see that it's kind of hokey and obvious and just simplistic. Things are much more gray than she makes it out to be. But then along comes David Hazoni, who's quite a scholar and also has the same approach. It's much more learned, and he could trot out chapter and verse much more freely than she. But he also argues for the Ten Commandments being a blueprint for personal satisfaction. And when you think about the Ten Commandments, they're really a collective document. It's a social contract. It's really not about the self. It's really about the self in relationship to the community. So I think between the therapeuticization and the dumbing down and the vernacularizing, all of that stuff, and the primacy of the self, something, I think, gets lost in that process of translation.
Yeah, and it does reflect a lot of what's going on in our culture today.
Yeah, feel good, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I want to thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation, and your book is terrific and full of all kinds of interesting insights and anecdotes, most of which I was not aware of. So, Jenna Weissman Joselit, thank you so much for speaking to us at In the Past Lane.
It's my pleasure. So glad you enjoyed the book.
Historian Jenna Weissman Joselit is author of Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments, just published by Oxford University Press. And to see some of the images Jenna mentioned, just head over to our website, inthepastlane.com. Well, citizens, we've reached the end of this episode of In the Past Lane. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think of this episode and this podcast. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions along via Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Please also leave a starred review, even just a sentence or two, at Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews are really helpful for attracting new listeners. Thanks. If you want to learn more about this episode's topic, you'll find it at our website, inthepastlane.com. There you'll find a show page that has recommended readings, links, and show credits. Thanks to all the terrific people who make In the Past Lane possible, including associate producer Devin McHugh. Thanks also to the Free Music Archive, which supplied most of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, you get the last word. What's your favorite commandment?
Number 13.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.